Driving While Black: How Black Americans Fought Back Against Segregation and Racism in the Jim Crow Era. For Black Americans in Jim Crow America, the simple act of owning and driving a car was a powerful show of resistance. Now, why would you think that? The end of the Civil War may have given Black Americans their freedom with emancipation, but true freedom would not be realized for over a century, because the former slave owners of the South, who had previously controlled every movement of these enslaved people, knew that freedom requires one essential thing. One thing to make it feel real in the minds of those who might want to find a place to plant their roots, visit family back home, or even just explore for the sake of getting in the car or boarding a train or a plane and just going. The freedom of movement. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? I mean, if you're a white dude living in America today, hearing that statement might actually sound a little ridiculous. You might say, of course freedom is movement. Everyone has the right to move around. It's guaranteed in the Constitution. But for Black Americans in the Jim Crow era, that freedom of movement was not a given. And even today, the simple act of driving while Black can be a life-threatening decision, especially if you're dealing with the police. Now, if you're a white American who wants to put yourself into the shoes of a Black person in one of these situations, there is a powerful example of this in Lovecraft Country, a supernatural horror novel by Matt Ruff. The power of fiction. In the opening chapter of Lovecraft Country, Atticus Turner leaves the army after having served in the Korean War, and he decides to head home to Chicago, where his family lives. On his way back home, Atticus has the displeasure of being stopped by a state trooper just outside the limits of a sundown town, which are towns where people of color are strongly encouraged to move along before the sun sets, or else. Wild. It's already close to sunset when Atticus commits the cardinal sin of being both Black and seen driving a Cadillac. And before he knows it, the trooper makes a U-turn and starts tailing him. Atticus is already on full alert before the lights and siren come screaming into his rearview mirror. And Atticus does exactly what every Black person in real life has taught their children to do in situations like this. He takes out his documents, the bill of sale for the car, his driver's license, and places them all on the passenger seat in plain view of the trooper. In Jim Crow America, there can be no doubt about what Atticus is reaching for if he values his life. Then he carefully places both hands on the steering wheel. The trooper takes his sweet time getting out of the patrol car and approaches Atticus's window. "Is this your car?" he began. "Yes, sir," Atticus said. Without taking his hands off the wheel, he inclined his head towards the papers in the passenger seat. "Show me." Atticus handed him the documents. "Atticus Turner," the state trooper said, reading the name off his license. "You know why I stopped you?" "No, sir," Atticus lied. "You weren't speeding," the trooper assured him. "But when I saw your license plate, well, I was worried. You might have got lost. Florida's the other way." Atticus grips the wheel a little tighter. "I'm going to Chicago, sir." "What for?" "Family. My dad needs me." "But you live in Florida." "I've been working down in Jacksonville since I got out of the service." The trooper continues to probe Atticus, effectively wasting his time as the sun slowly sets. A subtle but effective threat of violence. And when Atticus mentions that he's got science fiction books in his trunk, the thought of a Black person reading is too much for this trooper's tiny brain. And he makes Atticus get out of his car, where he can then rough him up a bit, force him to open his trunk, and then go through his stuff. He even picks up a gift-wrapped box and tears it open when Atticus tells him it's for his uncle, and then lets the book inside fall, splayed open onto the bed of the trunk. A legit cardinal sin for any reader. And then the trooper grabs another book, The Safe Negro Travel Guide, and holds it up, mockingly asking if it's a book full of addresses that serve colored people. And when Atticus says yes, the trooper laughs and notes that, well, it ain't very thick. Then the real horror sets in. "All right," the trooper said finally, "I'm going to let you go. But I'm keeping this guidebook. Don't worry," he added, forestalling the objection that Atticus knew better than to make. "You won't need it anymore. You say you're going to Chicago? Well, between here and there, there's no place that you want to stop." Understood? Atticus understood. While that's where the book leaves off, the HBO adaptation of the novel does go one step further, and the trooper gives chase after Atticus, giving him a 5-minute head start and creating a genuinely frightening sequence that makes you truly concerned for Atticus, even as a white person who's never had to worry about a cop shooting me for the crime of being born with the wrong skin. This scene is an effective fictionalized example of the kinds of dangers that Black Americans had to put up with just for daring to exist. Dangers that still exist today. As we'll come to learn, white America was largely oblivious to the absolute bullshit that Black America had to deal with throughout the Jim Crow America. The research that went into this show has shined light on the ways that white Americans are sheltered from the horrific realities of slavery, Jim Crow, and the inherent racism that is baked into our society that Black Americans continue to struggle against every single day. As someone who grew up in California, went to California schools, and was raised in a fundamentalist and creationist household, Eric, the head writer of this episode, he knows very well how powerful a tool education can be. But just as education can help to spread the democratic principles and free the oppressed, the deliberate suppression of education can also harm societies. And it has harmed both Black and white Americans by denying us all a truly integrated society. But while fiction and representation like what we see in Lovecraft Country, Star Trek, Ryan Coogler's Sinners, and every single one of Jordan Peele's movies, it is so important for breaking through barriers like that. And seriously, if you have not seen Get Out or Sinners, you need to. Also, if you are looking to continue to educate yourself, the oppression and the ways that people are treated differently based on their skin tone, I highly encourage you to watch The Perfect Neighbor, a new documentary that has just been released on Netflix. It utilizes home security cams, police footage, and it paints a very accurate picture of what many of our neighbors are having to live with. Now, education alone won't break the cycle of racial oppression that we are in. As you are about to see from the example of the civil rights movement and the countless Black drivers who resisted Jim Crow America, it is not one thing that will break the figurative chains of oppression, but rather a whole community of folks and businesses working together to care for and support each other while they fight back against oppression. Community is kryptonite to fascists. Driving while Black in Jim Crow America. Even though the threat of being stopped by some dickhead sheriff or state trooper with an itchy trigger finger or a mob of angry white vigilantes ready to string up anyone with a complexion one shade darker than a tan, the lack of hotels or lodgings willing to cater to Black Americans, and not to mention the lack of bathrooms, gas stations, or restaurants willing to serve them, was a real and present danger regardless of whether a person was traveling in the North or South. They still chose to drive, though. The question you might be asking yourself, though, is probably, why? Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Mark Twain. Mark Twain said this, and it resonated with the Black community at the time. Unrestricted movement is freedom. Remember that. Travel is a tool for education, because when people travel, they have to interact with people and cultures different from their own, and those interactions over time will have an effect on the traveler's worldview. I want you to think for a second about how traveling has changed your perspective on something. Has traveling or interacting with other communities affected your politics? Has traveling affected your belief systems or made you more aware of what you do and don't have at home? In the years after the Civil War, from Reconstruction through Jim Crow and onward through the Civil Rights era, Black Americans have been painfully aware of that fact. But so was the South and the rest of the United States. In the aftermath of the Civil War, lots of Black Americans traveled, and they traveled for so many reasons. The Great Migration saw an estimated 6 million Americans flee the South for a better life in cities like Chicago, LA, New York, Philadelphia, Newark, and even RoboCop's future home of Detroit. To this day, it is the largest migration in the history of the United States. And the South understood the simple equation of mobility equals freedom. And they figured if Black Americans wanted to be free, well, they would make it as hard as they could to reach that goal. In the antebellum period of our country's history, which is usually interpreted to be the decades leading up to the Civil War, Black mobility wasn't just restricted, it was shackled and heavily policed. But we will come back to that later. In the wake of emancipation, some Black families traveled to find lost family members displaced by the cruelties inherent in the system of slavery. Some traveled because they wanted to. Black Americans weren't just fleeing the South to get away from Jim Crow either. They were actually hoping for a chance to make something of themselves, something that all of us can relate to. They wanted economic equality. They wanted to not be terrorized, and they hoped that these new places would offer them an escape from segregation. And note, they did find some of those things that they were looking for, but even the North was not immune to the virus that was Jim Crow. Freedom did not come immediately for Black Americans. Powerful whites, boo, protested every degree of freedom being offered to Black Americans in the wake of emancipation. And while the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution granted voting rights to all races, and all means all, Black men were still denied the right by state constitutions and racist laws, taxes, and literacy tests. And of course, we can't forget about the outright intimidation that would happen at polling locations and beyond. Now, Black Americans would have to suffer through decades of civil disobedience, resistance, and demonstrations before they would finally be granted the dignity of being able to perform their civic duty in 1964 with the passage of the 24th Amendment, and then the Voting Rights Act in 1965. From the date of the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1865, to the passing of the Voting Rights Act on August 6th, 1965, Black Americans had to wait 102 years to have their freedom truly realized, at least on paper. 102 years. Just think about that for a second. And over the course of those 102 years, Black Americans remained patient in the face of Jim Crow laws that forced them to use different bathrooms, drinking fountains, buses, smoke and soot-filled train cars, and the threat of violence all over the country should they even have the audacity to show up in a space meant for a white person. How would you feel if you knew that your family would have to wait even half that long just to be able to use a public bathroom? But in 1886, the automobile arrived, and though initially only wealthy white Americans could afford them, the arrival of used Model Ts and eventually affordable new vehicles changed everything. Suddenly, Black folks could buy an automobile and not have to suffer through the indignities of Jim Crow's America. And with that, they could go wherever they wished, right? Well, no, not quite. Jim Crow America soon became wise to the fact that Black Americans were buying up automobiles left and right, and they were absolute crybabies about it. Black Americans favored the larger and more expensive cars, and the popular white American belief at the time was that those were just trying to imitate wealthy white people. No! The truth was, though, that these Americans favored the larger and more expensive cars because they never knew when or if they would be able to stop, to rest, eat, or answer the call of nature. Where will you stay tonight? An innocent enough question that quickly becomes a life or death ordeal in Jim Crow America. In comes the police. Now, it's pretty common knowledge outside of white circles that the institution of policing got its start in the middle of slavery as a means to track down fugitive slaves and return them to their owners. And if you're saying, but I didn't know that, or if you're furiously checking Google right now to figure out if everything that you've been led to believe is a lie, remember what I said earlier about how the restriction of education can harm communities, even you or me. They want to keep us ignorant. During the days of slavery, many enslaved Black Americans never left their local area, and some never even left the property that they were being forced to live upon. If an enslaved Black American was allowed to leave at all, they had to carry a pass with them. And if they were caught without a pass, they would be beaten, whipped, and sent home bleeding. But slavery and Jim Crow are not ancient history. While none of the enslaved Black Americans are around now to tell us their tales, the U.S. government actually made an effort to record their stories of former slaves in the 1930s. Ida Henry, an 83-year-old Black woman who participated in the Federal Writers Project that went from 1936 to 1938 in an effort to record the stories of former slaves, explained this. We would be sorry when dark, as the patrollers would walk through to quarters and the homes of the slaves all times of the night with pine torch lights to whip the peoples found away from their homes. At nights when my mother would slip away for a visit to some of the neighbors' homes, she would rise up the old plank floors to the log cabin and make pallets on the ground and put us to bed and put the floor back down so that we couldn't be seen or found by the patrollers on their stroll around at nights. The powerful mental image of what the policing of enslaved Black Americans would have looked and felt like. Imagine if you were one of those children forced to hide beneath a neighbor's floorboards for the terrible crime of visiting a friend, or a neighbor, or a relative. But there's also something quite strange about this quote. It is time for a side tangent, y'all.
This is going to be good.
Choosing to transcribe this woman's way of speaking phonetically strikes me as a deliberate choice on the part of the white government researcher assigned to tell Ida's story. I've read a few of the stories out of Born in Slavery, and some of them are almost impossible to transcribe because of the use of this weird way of representing the accents of Black Americans at this time. I think it's some sort of weird form of colonial otherism to just make them sound very, very different and put them over in the corner. And I think it's important to note that the storyteller has a lot of power in how people absorb that story. So when writers like these government workers who interview these Black Americans and then transcribe their stories, or, someone like H.P. Lovecraft decides to make former slaves sound like, Jar Jar Binks or caricatures, it intentionally feeds into racist stereotypes. The words and the way that we choose to represent minority voices have power. Do better. And also, why aren't we having Black researchers researching Black culture? Fast forward to the Jim Crow era again, and you've got a lot of angry white folks just itching for Black people to come rolling into their towns. So they invented more ways to be weird and very wrong. They created things like sundown towns, which sound like that. You shouldn't be in town after sundown. Racial vigilantes deputized to enforce the established social order. The Ku Klux Klan, and at the top of the racist pyramid, you have the police. So what are Black Americans to do about all of these dangers? How do they find their freedom in the land of the not free? Well, they create travel guides like the fictional one in Lovecraft Country. The Negro Motorist Green Book, originally authored by Victor Green and managed by his incredibly talented wife, Alma Duke, was the most popular safe travel guide for Black Americans hoping to avoid the perils of Jim Crow America. But it wasn't the first. Other guides had popped up before and after the Green Book hit Esso gas station shelves, which would eventually become the Exxon Corporation after a rebranding, and other locations across the nation. But the Green Book, it was the best-selling, the biggest, and the longest-lasting of all of those inspiring publications. These guides, they featured everything from simple addresses to full-page ads for businesses willing to cater to Black Americans. And y'all, this created an entire economy that was completely hidden from the eyes of judgmental white Americans. A hidden world, if you will. In the face of racism and adversary, these Americans were able to make something beautiful out of practically nothing. If white America wasn't going to offer them safety, security, and recreation, then by God, they're just going to build it themselves. And they did. Places where enterprising Black Americans created businesses by buying up beaches, clubs, and other recreational hotspots like Bruce's Beach in California, Club Alabama in LA, Crystal Caverns in Washington, D.C., and the Savoy Ballroom in New York City. They provided vacation and entertainment venues where Black people could enjoy themselves without worrying about the presence of angry, malicious white dudes. That's a good thing. The Green Book and every travel guide like it didn't just provide the locations of places. It was a quiet piece of resistance, designed to be deceptively non-political, like some education shows you might be watching right now. We're not political at all. We're the most political.
I'm so into voguing right now.
Every word was carefully curated to ensure prying white eyes wouldn't find the contents offensive. While it's important to mention that some people felt these guidebooks were in favor of segregation, when you actually look at the larger picture, and when you understand that even the threat of violence can be debilitatingly stressful for Black drivers, you start to see the Green Book for the piece of activist literature that it was. But the civilized tone didn't last forever. In the 50s and 60s, the Green Book began championing the civil rights movement. Yes! Victor Green knew there would come a day when his travel guide wouldn't be needed, and he looked forward to that day. His goal was to have his company go out of business. Driving while Black in the 21st century. While the Voting Rights Act and the 15th Amendment may have given Black Americans the civil rights they were owed, today, the police are still an ever-present danger for Black drivers. Back in 2020, Gretchen Soren reported in Driving While Black that 73% of all Black Americans believed the justice system doesn't treat them well. But 53% of all white Americans thought the system was working just fine. It might surprise you also to find out that sundown towns still exist today. In fact, there's an actual website where you and your family can go check to make sure that your next destination is going to be friendly to you and yours. The website will be linked in the description for the show. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, sundown towns still exist. Racism still exists. For many Black Americans, a cop is a cop. Sure, there is a possibility that he might be a nice guy, but come on. The reality is that that guy has a gun and a badge. And I mean, is it worth the risk? The phrase driving while Black might be familiar to most white Americans as something that people say ironically in this era, but there is a horrific truth behind that phrase. If Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, Emmett Till, or Mike Brown were still around, they would probably tell you that it actually really matters and that what it really means. But since they're not, and we're going to have to do the best that we can with what and who we get. Namely the internet, and a brilliant book called Driving While Black by Gretchen Soren and our army of feral historians. We are trying to speak for those lost voices. And that truth, as far as I understand it, is that driving while Black, it's not just about driving. It's about doing anything while being Black. Because that's a reality that Black Americans have to face every day when leaving their homes. Is this traffic stop going to turn fatal? Will I be killed for walking in the wrong neighborhood? Could I just cross the street and try to talk to my neighbor and then have something horrific happen to me in front of my own child? That's the reality that they have to live with nowadays. It's just as true today as it was in the middle of Jim Crow that a Black child's education must always include how to deal with the police and the racism inherent in our society. Black children are cute until they're not. Once Black men reach a certain age, meaning whatever age white men start to be afraid of them, well, parents have to have incredibly difficult conversations with them. Christopher West, one of the many historians chosen to be interviewed for the Driving While Black documentary based on that book by Gretchen Soren, had something powerful to say that I want you all to really think about. If I have to fear the state of which we are all a part of, then am I a member of that state? And is my son? Christopher West, historian, Pasadena College. But amidst all of this heartbreak and doom and gloom, as our fight to save our very democracy is just getting serious, you might ask, how can we even push back against these issues? Well, as we established with our show on NASA's Voyager Declaration, the past informs the future. The civil rights movement gives us the perfect blueprint for how we can persist in resisting President Taco's fascist takeover of America. Did you know that the Montgomery bus boycott that forced the bus companies of the civil rights era to allow Black passengers to sit wherever the hell they damn well pleased could not have happened without all of those cars and information networks that sprang up in response to Jim Crow's America? Every act of resistance from the Black community, such as the many Black women who refused to give up their seats on buses before Rosa Parks made her iconic stand, such as Polly Murray, the first Black American woman to become an Episcopal priest, Irene Morgan, who was dragged from the bus by a sheriff and arrested, to the simple pleasure of Chuck Berry himself taking pride in his Cadillac, getting from A to B, to the marches and the demonstrations. These were like stepping stones to the eventual goal. None of us are free until all of us are free. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So everything that we are doing, from the letter writing campaigns, the petitions, the sit-ins, the memes that we share, to the fiction that we write, and even shows like this, we're all building those stepping stones to get to our eventual goal. A lot of people have asked, why is President Taco still stinking up the White House? Why have our protests not stopped the regime? And I want you to think back to the number that I mentioned earlier. From emancipation to the Voting Rights Act, how long was it that Black Americans had to wait? Do you remember? I'll wait. 102 years. The Black community put up with 102 years of bullshit to get what they were owed. And we can learn from that patience. We can take that blueprint and apply it to what we're doing, because we are just getting started. It is a marathon, not a sprint, y'all. Or, dare I say, road trip? Being able to find freedom on the open road amidst all sorts of oppression, that to me, ladies and gentlemen, is courage. This has been a Doculite Media production. My name is Lacie Madison. I am your host of Courage, Stories of Everyday Hope. Please share this everywhere. Like and subscribe. Let our writers know your favorite part below, as we are a new show and it genuinely helps us find direction. Share us your stories of courage. Follow us on all of the social medias, and I'm wishing you all the best day ever. May the roads be open and the playlist bumping. We live in one of the largest nations in the world with a magical road system, and we should use it. Go travel. Thank you all so much, and goodbye.